Good morning. My name is Scott Snyder. I'm the CEO of a company called Decision Strategies International. Also spend quite a bit of time in the telecom space. I teach a 4G course at the University of Pennsylvania and recently wrote a book called The New World of Wireless, if you get a chance to read it. And it's about competing in the 4G revolution, whatever that is. We haven't quite figured out what 4G yet, but hopefully this conference will help us sort through some of that. One of the big topics related to 4G, and even today in 3G, 3.5G, 3 3/4, is the evolution of devices. And it used to be the old model was devices would get defined and pulled through by the carrier. And there was a fairly structured way of doing things. That's obviously been turned on its head with companies like RIM and what Apple's done recently, and even other companies coming to the table in parts of the device like Google, really trying to make the device its own platform that can really operate across many networks. And the device is now becoming more of the center of the user's experience versus just the network. So it brings up some really interesting questions, and we're going to get into it today with a panel that I think will give you a great perspective from both sides. One is the carrier side, so we have a couple of folks from Clearwire that you might consider a new world type carrier, certainly fairly new in terms of its own structure and existence and rolling out a new network on WiMAX. And then you're going to get a perspective from the device side with Mark Pecen from RIM, who runs the technology side of RIM and certainly has a good perspective on where devices are, where they can go, what are some of the real limitations. And I think we'll also get into this debate around what is a smartphone versus a mobile internet device. So let me just frame the discussion a little bit, but I want to get most of the time centered on these guys and let them really tackle the issue from a couple sides. So I'm going to frame it. We'll get actually I'm going to have Pat go first and talk about the mobile internet a little bit, Mark with the device evolution, and then we'll have Sean tackle where are we with some of these devices and where can it go. So just to frame the discussion, you guys have probably seen some of these slides in different forms. This happens to be from RBC, a recent analyst report from August. And it kind of puts smartphones in perspective. So while smartphones, probably in this crowd at this conference, which would be a lead user crowd by any measure, smartphones are pretty penetrated. But there's only 165 million projected by the end of this year in the world. Right? So if you consider almost a 4 billion population of mobile users, still a lot of upside here to grow. And even if you throw out the bottom of the pyramid, the so-called $2 a day crowd in emerging markets, there's still a lot of runway here for smartphones. So relative to other technologies, huge amounts of runway, huge growth rate, over 30% a year on aggregate. So really pretty exciting market and fairly emerging at this point. The traditional view, as I mentioned at the beginning, was build it and they will come attitude, that the carriers would put out networks that had a capability, would define the devices that could operate on those networks and what those devices can do in a very tight requirement set. And ultimately, device vendors would design to that, and hopefully application vendors would come along and develop compelling applications. I think we all realize that model's really been shaken recently, and for many of us in a good way. Right? So the user is now playing a role in this whole ecosystem. Whereas the user used to pretty much take what they could get from the system, the user's now participating in innovation. So whether it's designing applications for the BlackBerry or for the iPhone, or really influencing the idea of open networks and the ability of wanting to be able to roam between Wi-Fi and 3G networks, or even Bluetooth and Zigbee networks, if we talk about sensors, that pull from the user side and even the innovation piece is creating a whole new pressure in the system, that we call DNA, devices, networks, and applications. So I think part of what you're going to hear today is what kind of devices will support the applications the users really want. And maybe that's going to drive what kind of networks we need. And even if you think about LTE and WiMAX and some of the newer networks being talked about with white space, in many ways the requirements are being defined to try and capture this much more of an innovation platform instead of just saying, well, we're just going to turn the bandwidth up on the pipe. There's interoperability built into it. There's security. There's IP. It's really putting a platform out there so users can innovate and new devices can come to the market. The interesting thing is we have this very strange dynamic that there's not one dominant OS out there. And that really creates a challenge for the application guys. And by the way, I don't believe this chart. I threw it up to provoke things a little bit. This data says that 76% of the new startups developing applications are designing for 6 OSs. I think that's garbage. That's not true. They may say that to their venture investors and to their boards that we're going to build an application once, it's going to work on every device. The reality of doing that's pretty hard. Right? So if you look at, what's that?
You think it's less?
Oh yeah, I think it's 1 or 2. If you look at most companies, they've decided to target an OS. They may have long-term plans to migrate, and the reality is middleware, like it exists in the IT world, isn't as robust in the mobile world yet. Nobody's figured out that build once, play anywhere kind of solution. There are people working on it, but it's not that effective. It's overhead intensive. So you look at this chart and you say, okay, even if this is not true, it presents a challenge. And I think it presents a challenge for the device guys and the application guys and even the carriers themselves, because if you're a carrier, you want any device you put out there to be able to support compelling applications, because it's, in theory, you're going to get a share of that revenue. So I throw this out there also for these guys to chew on, because any of these new devices are going to be built on an operating system. And to what extent, is that going to be a limitation or even open up opportunities? Because nobody's dominating things yet. So just before I get off the stage and start to facilitate the discussion, a couple of questions that are framed around what the new device of the future or the mid or smartphone is going to look like. How are these things going to change what we can do? So what will the capability envelope look like? What are the differences? So there's a lot of terms being thrown out there, from netbooks to mids to UMPCs to smartphones. What's really the difference, or is this just one continuum of devices with the same chipset and the same kind of applications, but they just have different capability envelopes? And how will WiMAX and LTE factor into all this? Will they accelerate demand? Will it really, putting this cloud out there is going to really spur on and be a catalyst for these devices to get out there faster? And how quickly will these devices be adopted? And I'll even throw the last question in that hopefully these guys will talk to us. How will it change the business models? And who makes money in this whole value chain? The last piece of data that I find really interesting, because the U.S. and European market are often compared, in many ways Europe's been ahead as a lead user of new things like SMS and even adopting universal standards in the past. But recently people say maybe the U.S. is building that back with the App Store model. In Europe right now, netbook sales are 50% through the carriers. So I'll throw that out there. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that the carriers are still controlling this model much like they did the phones? Or do you see that changing fast where netbooks and other mids are going to be really distributed through independents and they're going to try and work on a variety of networks? So lots of questions. With that, why don't I tee it up, and I guess, Patrick, you want to have Mark go first?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think he's got a little bit more of a historical.
Okay. So let's do, Mark's going to try and take us back in time a little bit and bring us back to today. And I just selected a few slides there, Mark, I think for the quicker. So.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so thanks. I guess this is kind of unusual because I normally live 10 years in the future, but this is important, though, because I think you'll see some things that in recent years have changed the game tremendously. First mobiles were really marketed in the 50s. So this is Bell Laboratories in the United States put MTS, Mobile Telephony Service, and IMTS later in 1969 in the marketplace. The difference between the two is that in the 50s and 60s, MTS was operator assisted. Your mobile switching center had a person there that would actually place your calls for you and so on and so forth. Whereas starting from 69 all through the 70s, you had a little dial thing there. That's not the phone, by the way. That's just the control head. The phone is actually this 30-kilo gigantic box in the trunk of the car, you know. And pretty much these things proliferated. These were the market segment that these were sold to were primarily high-end industrial, high-end professional users. They were extremely expensive devices. Yet, by 1980, there was a 5-year waiting list in most U.S. and European cities and North American cities to get a phone number. So then in '83 we had cellular. This came out. This is all analog, and again it was mostly business and professional market segmentation, high-end users at first. The adoption was quick, but cellular was a major technological leap. You had aggressive frequency reuse. You had mobility control. You could traverse an environment, go in and out of these cells, as we started calling them, and still maintain contact. But to give you an example, though, that little device on the left in the blue is a Motorola 800X, and in 1983 that cost $4,000 US.
It still costs that much
So,
on eBay.
yeah, you probably could find one there. So again, this was a high-end game. You know, just to get in the mobile game, you had to come up with some pretty heavy cash in those days. Then GSM came in. We worked on this. I was involved in this in the late '80s through the '90s in Europe. It was mostly done in Sophie-Antipolis in France, where ETSI headquarters is located. The first version of the system was turned on in '92, and this was a quantum leap. You had highly defined reuse patterns, much more voice capacity. You had global roaming problems were pretty much solved with the HLR VLR concept. This was a light years ahead of the existing stuff. And Scott was talking about SMS for texting. Well, SMS was not really for texting. The reason it was there is because the coverage was so horrible in Europe that we needed something to tell you that you had a voicemail message. So, and that just sort of, then by accident, it became, 20% of Vodafone's revenue today is SMS. So, but the point is here, and if you go back and you look at what's from the past 50 years or so, mobile terminals were primarily viewed as voice. They were a technical substitute for wireline, and in many cases they were economic substitute, because I know when I had an apartment in the UK in London, and when I moved from one to the other, they said, BT said, well, it'll take a year to put your phone in. I said, forget about it. I'll just use my mobile. But it was pretty much a voice type of situation for all that time. But around 2001 or 2, something interesting happened, and you had not just voice, but you had email, you had messaging, and then today you've got even more than that. And I'll tell you what happened that actually started this. There's one set of forces, and that is that in 2001, the General Packet Radio Service began global rollout, and this was followed by EDGE, Enhanced Data for Global Evolution, and UMTS 3G, High-Speed Packet Access. So in other words, you actually had a pipe, a packet-based data pipe, right alongside any of these operator networks that carried voice, would carry data as well. So today you got the age of the smartphone. You got email browsing. So what's the definition of a smartphone? I don't know, but the closest one I could find is, it's a phone that does a lot of stuff. But the interesting thing is that the stuff that it does is sometimes interrelated. In other words, your navigation components is not just for navigation. It can be matched up with say the custom applications, or even I have a location-based weather application. It's really slick. You fire the thing up in a new city. It comes up, finds out where you're at, gives you the weather. And it's also push weather. It keeps updating itself. But anyway, this is what we've done, and when you think about it, the innovations from just a voice phone to the smartphone idea has really been only the past 6, 7, maybe 8 years tops. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I don't know if you did one more slide.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Patrick. If there was anybody who knew me in high school, you wouldn't be surprised. Realize I was late getting my homework in, so I'll have to switch laptops and
Do the hot swap, which is always a risk.
cross your fingers. All right, first I'm going to put my biases out there. I'm a longtime cellular guy. I come from the 3G world. And like Mark, I was always a few years ahead of everybody. And so I have got a unique perspective on this, and that I've been around the industry long enough to see several different changes. On the application side, I was the guy leading a really talented team of folks building our SMS and picture mail when we launched 1XRTT. So this was the introduction from voice to an initial set of services which we hope to monetize. This is back in like 2000, 2001. Then, just before that really started to monetize itself, I went out and started to do embedding and taking 3G radios with EVDO Rev-O and trying to stick them into other devices. And I remember really clearly, like in 2002, being in the Silicon Valley at a special interest group there. I was presenting alongside the senior director of Qualcomm. We were trying to explain 3G to these really talented guys from Silicon Valley. Qualcomm put up a slide, and they were like, you know, all these different applications crammed into the phone. And I said, no, with EVDO, we've now got for the first chance, and I put up a slide, it was just the opposite. It was a phone, now with all the arrows going to the portfolio and to the video camera and everything else. Now, in 2001, this was a little early, then we went on to Rev-A, and we launched the first Rev-A product in the industry, was a laptop. And even then, things have changed quite a bit in those industries. So I come at this from a unique device and application perspective, and as such, I thought I'd share some with you. First is some case studies. So I'm going to be provocative here. It's my MO usually, but I think it's appropriate here. I don't think mobile internet devices exist. Okay, and this is what I'm going to try and show you. So Wi-Fi and notebook PCs in a 5-year period went from essentially 0% to 100% penetration. Okay, why? Relative to the average selling price of a notebook, the chipset was actually really relatively inexpensive. It's a global standard, obviously backed by global players like Intel, with maybe some monopolistic pressure, but hey, everybody else adopted it too. The networks were deployed where people used them, and they were affordable for the most part. 3G. 3G in a 5-year period went from about 0% to about 4%. Now, I'm not looking at 2009 when we've kind of confused the business models and subsidized and sold netbooks. I'm just saying for that period. Now, clearly, we had some very bad business development people as an industry trying to do this. But our excuse was it was relatively high chipset cost. You know, magnitudes of order more expensive than Wi-Fi at the time. I would argue that we had network operator fragmentation, different hardware. You know, only with Gobi chip did you have all of the different networks in North America on one chip, GSM and EVDO, and both flavors of EVDO. At the time, though, you had to have a decision, which operator am I going to go with? Then you had to go through complex certification and different firmware, and $60 a month was not in the deep end of the demand curve. But if Wi-Fi is so good, how come it's languishing in consumer electronics like cameras? So I picked a 5-year period, 2004 to 2008, right? Relatively current timing, and about the same penetration as 3G in notebooks. My argument is relative to the cost of the device, the chipset's too expensive to crack that. The network operator fragmentation, I believe that there's operator fiefdoms in Wi-Fi. When I go to grandma's house, I'm constrained by her security protocols. I have to ask her network entry protocols, you know, username, password, and I can only go as far as her network. Is it A, B, G, N? Did she choose to put it in the basement? So I would argue that up to now, we haven't really had mobile internet devices. The notebooks, to the extent that they were open, are constrained with AT&T and Verizon. And I'm picking on those two just because they have restrictive end-user license agreements that say you can't stream media. You want to do Hulu on an embedded notebook? You got Verizon? Can't do it. You want to go to grandma's house and log in? You got to go with what she says, and you can't roam. It wasn't really mobile. These are nomadic internet experiences. But let's look at this from the customer perspective. The customer used to say, I want to communicate. And then they would say, I'm going to go to my phone at home and dial it. And then it evolved, and they could say, I want to communicate. I'm going to go get one of those Motorola things, and I'll call from my car. And I'll call from anywhere I go. And we had a very verticalized view from an industry of the user. But the user has this crazy notion of wanting to do other things, and they frequently change their mind, not on a day-by-day or hour-by-hour basis, but on a minute-by-minute basis. And they expect to do it in all different kinds of settings, and they expect to do it across all different kinds of devices. I mean, Fios now, I'm supposed to be able to go to my home phone and go to my Fios screen and set my TV. I can go to my Facebook on my iPhone. I can take pictures with my Wi-Fi camera, assuming I'm in coverage, and I can upload it to my Facebook, but only within a very narrow set of rules allowed by that interface. And clearly lots of different applications. But how are they connecting? Because I'm a network operator now, I'm going to have to make a plug on this. But I do argue that there hasn't been connections available to allow people to really do what they wanted to do across a vast variety of devices. Notice I've got the car in here. This isn't the Ford Sync Bluetooth pairing of a phone. This is what happens when you really connect the car to the broadband internet. And I'm not talking nav. I'm talking your wife pushing a shopping list to you that as you drive by Giant, it pops up, hey, you're going to need some milk at home. It's not showing up on your phone. Imagine your car telling you your 16-year-old who has the new Ford My Key, so you know it's her driving the car, just went faster than 55 miles an hour, or left the area that you've geocoded. Now your car is telling you this. Maybe it's telling it to you on the phone. Multiple devices operating. I'm going to steal a slide that I presented last year, Carl. I'm going to reuse this. You talked about users being a part of this. Users are not developing applications. Users are picking and choosing different devices and applications and putting them together in an amalgam. Remember back in 2002 when you dropped the phone, you were upset that when you dropped the phone, you couldn't get your contacts off of it. Now you drop the phone, you're upset because you can't talk anymore. Your contacts are in the cloud, right? So this is what a user's experience is. He's picking and choosing, or she's picking and choosing which applications to sync across all the different devices. These are the devices in my domain. These are some of the applications. So I have this kind of amalgamated experience. Network plug, okay, fair warning. So wireline, no mobility, so let's take mobile internet devices off. I can't have a mobile internet device. Wi-Fi, nomadic. 3G, it's nearly all places people go. The speeds are good. I've always argued $60 a month for wireless T1 is pretty good. But $60 a month is relatively expensive for most people, particularly if you're going to add the car for $60 a month and add the camera for $60 a month. Satellite, okay, line of sight, but really expensive, bad up, lots of different things. So it takes something like WiMAX to really crack through. And so I'm going to end with an application perspective. I would argue that Google Talk is one of the first applications to come into this and mix it up. Notice when I use mobile internet device, I do capital M, capital I, little case D. I'm hoping my colleague here can kind of speak to you guys about what you came to talk about, which is MIDs as we classically understood them because Intel told us to. But I'm trying to take this provocative stance to specifically look at this from a different angle. So I would argue that if this is done right, the application guys can be the lead here, not the network operators, not the device guys. Well, in this case, they are also an application folk. So Google now becomes the thing that somebody wants to interact with. If I want to communicate, I pull up Google on whatever device I've got it loaded. I can transfer phone calls from my mobile to my desk. I can roam across multiple different calls in a specific application session. The people who are talking to me don't need to know I'm at home or on my cellular or on my desk or I'm roaming between those three. So what this does for the first time, it puts the application guy in the front seat across a wide range of devices. Now, I think that this creates opportunities for the device guys to be strategic in response to this, but clearly, I think it's game-changing when you do have a mobile internet device and you start connecting people's landline and cars and smart meters at their home to the Zigbee appliances up on their washing machine. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my much more talented colleague. Yes, if you don't mind. He pays me to say talented. I think he's just cute.
Not much there.
I know you didn't say that.
Cuter. There's just a difference.
Okay, good.
Okay, my name is Sean Mullen. I work at Clearwire with Patrick. We both focus a lot on embedded devices, and I in particular focus on bringing to market wholesale type deals with, if you think of what the Kindle is and how they partner between Amazon and Sprint, deals of that nature are something I spend the bulk of my time focused on. But before people do wholesale deals, they have to make a decision to embed WiMAX or some other 4G technology. So we get really into the weeds on a day-to-day basis about exactly how you do that. So I want to make this informative for you guys in terms of what's happening today and what kind of we see happening over the next 18 months to 2 years. Okay, let's see what happened here. I'm just going to turn off the slideshow thing. Resume slideshow. Okay, let's see if that's going to work. Okay. So we talked a little bit earlier about the what seems to be ambiguity and transition in gray areas between what a smartphone is and what a mid is and what a netbook is and a smart book and things of that nature. The mid category was sort of invented by Intel a few years back, and it was sort of to carve out some space, and they kind of defined it through their marketing organization. It's a multimedia capable handheld computer providing wireless internet access designed to provide entertainment, information, and location-based services for personal use. They're larger than smartphones, but smaller than UMPCs, which are, think the Asus device. There's a perceived gap between mobiles and laptops, and they're powered by the Intel Atom processor, which is you see commonly these days in netbook computers. As I was kicking around the topic with Patrick, we kind of came to the kind of realization that there hasn't been really internet-connected devices up to this point on a form factor that's about this form factor. Some of you may be familiar with the Milo device that Sony came out with a few years ago. There's a device by Mondi, which is on our network, which we just introduced recently. But there really hasn't been a 3G connected device in a very broad scale or wide area network kind of sense. Most of the other devices are just Wi-Fi connections, which really doesn't deliver the value proposition of a mobile internet device. So there really hasn't been, in my view, a mobile internet device. And a lot of the questions that we're asking ourselves, I've had similar conversations for the last 3 or 4 years. So the question is, what is different now about having the conversation than the ones we had, in 2005 and 2006 and 2007 and 2008? So we'll try to get into some of that. Again, the mid is essentially between 5 and 7 inches diagonal measurement of the screen. Which essentially drives whether or not you can put it in your bag or in your suit jacket. That's kind of my test. If I can put it in my suit jacket, then it's a mid. The keyboard, they come in a couple different flavors. They have the hard, like a keyboard on a laptop, or they have touch screens. The battery life tends to be short, and you see complaints in that area. This is a device that is popular throughout the world. It's coming in the U.S. It's got Wi-Fi connection. I'm not sure if this actually has launched yet, but you may be seeing this coming in the future. Let's see. Okay. Let's talk about Intel's expectations and things that have been set for the last 3 years, which kind of give the impression that the mids maybe has not been as successful as Intel would have liked. Again, these were estimations that were made 2 or 3 years ago, and I would argue that the devices were not really connected to the internet. Partly that's on us because we had planned to have our 4G network out there 2 or 3 years ago. Things have been delayed for us, but now we're getting progress. We've opened up a lot of metro areas this year, and we're going to have about 120 million people under coverage by the end of next year. So I would argue that it's really been mostly on the carriers to have the connectivity available for these devices to really ask ourselves whether or not this category is going to be successful or not. The netbooks have kind of caught a lot of people by surprise. I think over the last 6 months or so, people have realized this is an enormous category. It is mostly, in my opinion, based on price. Netbooks are about $200 to $300, and if you wrap that around a subsidy like you're seeing in Europe, it can be free for the customer because they're signing up for a $50 a month service plan. So that's the innovation in the business model, is that if you introduce subsidies, that will drive consumer adoption. One of the things that we started our business around at Clearwire is we said we're not going to subsidize. Let me back up. We did a lot of customer focus groups and user focus groups, and people complained about contracts, and they complained about termination fees, and a lot of complaining about that. So we said, okay, fine, we're not going to have any contracts that lock people in. We're listening to the customers. So we said we're not going to subsidize devices, and so, for example, we have a USB modem that we sell for $50. It seems like a pretty low price, but we also offer the ability for customers to lease that for $4 a month. And I can't share the exact numbers with you, but that makes a difference. Again, this group is probably in the top 10% on sort of income in the country, but I was astonished at the number of the uptake of the $4 a month lease over buying a $50 USB modem. So consumers really want very low prices, probably more than anything, and then they complain about other things. So they want the best of everything, but you can't be that literal about it. You can't be dogmatic. You have to listen to the customer and give them choice, and they will choose and lead you in the direction that makes sense. So far, there has been a relatively small market for mids. And again, my opinion is because we haven't had the network out there. Other areas that people are interested in improving is battery life. Again, price is enormous. If netbooks are selling for $250 and you, for example, have a Nokia 810 out there for $400 or $500, customers have a hard time buying that more expensive mid, especially when the network is not there to connect it. So I would argue the Nokia 810, if people are familiar with that device in the room, again, we were not delivering coverage in time for that. So that was, we didn't, all the pieces in the puzzle have to be there to decide whether or not it's going to work or not. And to date, that hasn't happened. I think it's going to happen this year and next year.
What's the profile of the customer?
The demographic or?
Oh, what's the profile of the customer that you're marketing for the mid to?
Well,
Is it,
so I just want to reframe. You said that you are marketing a mid to. You're talking to a carrier, and you're talking.
I'm sorry, the industry.
There you go. Because the carriers used to be the ones that tried to say, I'm the best to sell notebooks, which I'll be the first to tell you, our salespeople couldn't sell notebooks when we embedded them. We weren't selling the notebooks. We were letting the OEMs sell the notebooks with the connectivity through their channels. So just since that's a switch in the industry, the carrier's no longer selling the hardware, it's letting the OEMs. That's why I wanted to be real specific that it's not us. It is the OEMs.
The category of mid
Right.
is available to a user group or user groups. I just wonder what that user group looks like.
We believe that the mid will be a companion device. So the first filter on the demographics or segmentation would be someone who already has a smartphone or laptop. This probably will not be the very first device. Again, I don't want to be dogmatic about that. We'll look at the numbers and let the numbers take us where they take us. That's kind of what our point of view is going into the market. So it's people who have already have it. It's a complementary device. It's something that's always on, something that's pocketable. So it's a younger demographic. That would be I think our view. I can get you, if you're interested, you can come to me later and give you some more detailed segmentation, because we've done some very, very detailed work on that. I don't have it top of mind beyond what I've just sort of shared with you.
I skipped over some notes on my Google slide, the application perspective, but at the bottom of that you may have seen what types of applications are appropriate for the mobile internet device or to the mobile internet. And those are applications in which the data is very time sensitive. Applications which are part of a user's lifestyle, applications in which there's high value associated with the data. And there was another element there, and I can't remember what it is. So when you see those slides, I would say that that's the type of application that you would look at and say, what does a mid do better than a phone? And so if I switch back and forth between iPhone, which is what classically I think is probably the most established, closest to a mobile internet device, although given it rules based upon the application store and the network, it's still not an open device. I would say that on a mid, I can do better content creation, and on a iPhone, I can do better content consumption. And there are certain applications that fall according to those criteria I gave you before that are going to operate better in a mid. But the cleanest example I can give you is content creation on a mid is probably a little bit easier than on an iPhone, with the exception of taking pictures. If you have anything to add.
Let me see how close. Yeah, I just had one more slide. But that's the only thing else to add is mids need to be always on, which is an advantage over laptops. The 5 to 10 minutes to start up is something that consumers have told us they don't like. I want to open up to Q&A, or let Scott do that, or if you have questions for me, I'm happy to take those. But let me share a couple practical kind of numbers with you, with the group, because we do this on a day in and day out basis. So we have a certification lab at our company, and ultimately there'll be a WiMAX form certification lab. So we're not the gatekeepers on that. The process, it takes a couple months. There's no charge to us. We don't charge people to put their devices into our certification labs. There's a number of mid devices now and other type of form factors, as well as netbooks and laptops in our labs today that we're certifying. Again, it's a free process. It takes a couple months. The bill of material costs for devices coming to the market next year is about $25 to add WiMAX to the device. The important point that Patrick talked about is that For example, digital cameras, the sweet spot for digital cameras is about $150, and you'll find that about 80% of all digital cameras sold are that price point or below. So $25 for someone in the sweet spot of digital cameras, it's not really immaterial. And the work that we've done, I think, kind of points out that unless it's about 5% or less of the retail price of the product, there will not be sort of natural, spontaneous combustion on embedding. So we've kind of entered the marketplace and give some people some incentives, whether it's rebate or wrapping a wholesale plan around or some other marketing incentives to help get things out there. And again, we're not buying, taking inventory, reselling, but trying to get those channels through Walmart and Best Buy kind of up and going. Yeah.
Carl, just real quick, what's your expectation for the WiMAX certification to actually start impacting retail? And basically we'll start seeing that, Best Buy or Fry's or somebody like that will have WiMAX certified devices out there that you guys will be.
I think Best Buy has them already in the market. So
Yeah, already. And I don't think that there was a question in the agenda here, is certification necessary? Absolutely. You need to have FCC certification in the United States. Wi-Fi, you need to have an industry standard global certification. I'd say that's about where we need to stop. I'd say what needs to go away is the carrier certification, and that transition will occur. I insist that we need global certification, but I also think that until the WiMAX forum is stood up over the next 12 months, you'll still see Clearwire